The laughter echoed across the marble lobby like broken glass. Brooke felt each snicker as a physical blow, her fingers tightening around the serving tray until her knuckles went pale. 3 women in designer dresses sat clustered near the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Metropolitan Hotel, their manicured hands covering their mouths in mock discretion as they mimicked her southern drawl. She had only asked if they needed fresh champagne. That was all. But apparently, her Alabama accent was entertainment enough for their Thursday afternoon. Brooke swallowed the familiar burn of humiliation and turned away, focusing on the geometric patterns of the Italian marble beneath her feet. She had learned long ago that responding only made it worse. What she didn't know was that across the lobby, partially hidden behind the architectural column near the private elevator, a man with ice blue eyes and a scar bisecting his left eyebrow had stopped mid-stride. Arkady Volodin hadn't paused for anyone in 15 years, but something about the way this woman held her spine perfectly straight, even as her torso seemed to collapse inward, made his jaw tighten. He knew that posture. He had worn it himself once, in another life, in another country, when being different meant being prey. Brooke Hayes had never planned to work at the Metropolitan. She had a degree in art history from Auburn, dreams of curating exhibitions, and a carefully constructed 5-year plan that had disintegrated the moment her mother was diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer/S. Medical bills didn't care about dreams. So here she was, 28 years old, serving champagne to women who probably spent more on their manicures than Brooke made in a week. The uniform was too tight across her shoulders, the smile she wore was practiced to perfection, and the accent she couldn't shake no matter how many diction videos she watched on YouTube made her a target. Always a target. She had tried to soften it, flatten the vowels, clip the endings, but it clung to her like humidity, especially when she was nervous or tired, which was always. The women were still laughing when she reached the service hallway, the sound following her like smoke. She leaned against the wall, closed her eyes, and counted to 10 in French. It was a trick her college roommate had taught her. Something about switching languages that calmed the nervous system. It didn't work. But it gave her something to do with the rage that sat permanent and hot beneath her sternum. The first time Arkady Volodin actually spoke to her was 3 days later, and it wasn't /T, the romantic meet-cute Brooke would later wish she could rewrite. She had been cornered in the wine cellar by Marcus Chen, the hotel /S assistant manager, who had developed the unfortunate habit of standing too close and letting his eyes linger too long. His hand was on the wall beside her head, blocking her exit, and he was saying something about how exotic he found her accent, how refreshing, when a voice cut through the dim lighting like a blade. The voice had an accent too, Russian, thick and unapologetic, wrapped around perfect English with the confidence of a man who had never apologized for taking up space. Marcus straightened so fast, he nearly gave himself whiplash. Brooke looked past him to see a man in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than her car, filling the doorway with the kind of presence that didn't require volume. He wasn't particularly tall, maybe 6 feet, but he carried himself like he owned the building. Which, as it turned out, he did. Arkady Volodin. Even Brooke, who worked in the trenches of the service industry and knew nothing about the city /S power structures, had heard whisper. Import-export, which everyone knew meant something else entirely. Connections to Moscow that made the hotel manager sweat. A reputation for being ruthless in business and invisible in public. Marcus was already stammering an apology, backing away like a dog that had been kicked. Arkady didn't look at him. His eyes, that particular shade of blue that looked gray in certain lights, were fixed on Brooke with an intensity that made her skin prickle. He said something in Russian, curt and dismissive, and Marcus practically ran. The silence that followed was dense enough to have weight. Brooke pressed her spine against the wine rack and tried to remember how to breathe normally. This was it. She was going to get fired. Men like him didn't intervene in situations like this without expecting something in return, and she had precisely 0 to offer. But Arkady didn't move closer. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, studying her with the same focus he might give a painting he was considering for purchase. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost none of its edge, but there was something underneath it that she couldn't identify. He asked if she was all right, and the question was so unexpected that Brooke laughed. Not a real laugh. The kind that comes out when the alternative is crying. She told him she was fine, which was such an obvious lie. It wasn't /T a nice smile. It was the smile of someone who recognized survival instinct in another person because he had honed his own to a weapon. He told her Marcus wouldn't /T bother her again. Then he left, and Brooke stood in the wine cellar for another 10 minutes, trying to understand what had just happened. The encounters became a pattern. Not frequent enough to be predictable, but regular enough that Brooke started to anticipate them with a mixture of dread and something she refused to name. Arcady appeared in the hotel at odd hours. Sometimes she would see him in the executive lounge, surrounded by men in expensive suits who looked like they had done things they would never discuss. Other times he would be alone, sitting in the library with a book in Russian, his expression unreadable. He always noticed her. Always. A nod when she brought him coffee. A question about her day that seemed genuine even though it shouldn't /T be. Once, when she was clearing tables and the same group of women started their routine mockery of her accent, Arcady had simply appeared beside their table and spoken in rapid Russian to the man with them. Whatever he said made the man go pale, and the women left within minutes, silent and subdued. Brooke wanted to be angry about it. She didn't /T need protecting, didn't /T want to owe this man anything. But she was also exhausted, and there was something seductive about the idea that someone with actual power might be on her side, even temporarily. She told herself it meant nothing. Men like him didn't /T have altruistic motivations. He probably found her amusing, a curiosity, the way wealthy people sometimes adopted stray cats. But then there was the night. It was nearly midnight when Brooke /S shift finally ended. She was exhausted in the way that goes beyond physical, where even your thoughts feel heavy. The parking garage was mostly empty, her sensible Honda Civic sitting alone under a flickering fluorescent light like a monument to practical choices and limited options. She was fumbling with her keys, thinking about her mother /S latest test results and whether she could afford the new medication the neurologist recommended when she heard the footsteps. Not the click of heels or the casual shuffle of someone heading to their car. These were purposeful, multiple sets. She turned and saw 3 men fanning out in a semicircle, blocking her path to the exit. They weren't /T guests. She knew that immediately. Their clothes were too casual, their postures too aggressive. The one in the middle had a tattoo creeping up his neck, Cyrillic letters that Brooke couldn't /T read. He smiled at her, and it was the kind of smile that made her stomach drop. He said something in Russian, and when she didn't /T respond, switched to accented English. They had questions about her friend, the one who owned the hotel. They thought she might be able to deliver a message. Brooke /S mind went blank with fear, the kind that makes you stupid. She tried to run, made it maybe 3 steps before a hand caught her arm, spinning her around. The man with the neck tattoo was still smiling, his grip bruising, when the gunshot cracked through the garage like lightning in an enclosed space. Everything happened in fragments after that. The man released her. Someone was shouting in Russian. Brooke fell, catching herself on the concrete, palms scraping raw. When she looked up, Arcady was there, flanked by 2 men who moved with military precision. He had a gun in his hand, held with the casual competence of someone who had done this before. Many times before. He wasn't /T pointing it at anyone, but the threat was implicit and absolute. More Russian, fast and furious, the kind of exchange that needed no translation. The 3 men backed away, hands raised, and disappeared into the stairwell. The entire encounter. Arcady crossed to Brooke in 3 strides, holstering the weapon somewhere inside his jacket in a movement so smooth it barely registered. He crouched beside her, and for the first time since she had met him, she saw something other than ice in his expression. Concern. Anger. Something that looked almost like fear. He asked if she was hurt, and his hands were already checking, gentle but thorough, cataloging bruises that would bloom purple by morning. Brooke couldn't /T speak. She was shaking so hard her teeth chattered. He made a sound low in his throat, something between a curse and a prayer, and before she could process what was happening, he had lifted her, cradling her against his chest as if she weighed nothing. She should have protested. Should have demanded he put her down, should have run in the opposite direction from this man who carried guns and spoke violence as a first language. Instead, she pressed her face into his shoulder and let herself be carried. Arcady took her to his penthouse. Not the hotel penthouse, his actual home, a fortress of glass and steel 30 floors above the city with security that would make government buildings jealous. Brooke was too shocked to argue, too overwhelmed to process. He set her on a leather sofa that probably cost more than her annual salary and disappeared, returning with a first aid kit and a bottle of vodka that looked older than she was. He cleaned her scraped palms with surprising gentleness, his touch clinical and careful, while he explained in that accent she was starting to find dangerously attractive that the men in the garage were part of a rival organization. That there had been tensions, territory disputes, the kind of business complications that sometimes turned violent. That she had become a target because she was visible, accessible, and he had been careless in showing her any attention. The guilt in his voice was unexpected, genuine. He told her she couldn't /T go home tonight, possibly not for several nights, that he would arrange security, a safe place, whatever she needed. But first, she needed to understand exactly who he was and what being associated with him meant, so he told her, not everything, probably not even a fraction of everything, but enough. His family /S history, the networks that stretched from Moscow to New York, the businesses that were legal and the ones that operated in the gray spaces where law became negotiable. He told her about the violence he had seen, the violence he had committed, the cost of the life he had chosen. He laid it out like evidence in a trial, giving her every reason to run. And Brooke, sitting on his expensive sofa with bandaged hands and adrenaline still singing through her veins, looked at this man who spoke murder as casually as most people discuss the weather, and asked the only question that mattered. She asked him why he had helped her, why the intervention with Marcus, the women in the lobby, the appearance in the garage at the exact moment she needed him. Why any of it? Arcady was silent for a long moment, and when he looked at her, something in his expression cracked open. He told her that 15 years ago he had been a different person. Younger, stupider, in love with a woman who didn't /T deserve him but whom he would have destroyed the world for. She had been killed in the crossfire of someone else /S war, and he had spent the decade and a half since becoming the kind of man who ensured that never happened again. Untouchable. Alone. And then 3 weeks ago, he had seen a woman with warm brown skin and a southern accent hold her spine straight while the world mocked her, and something in his chest that he thought was permanently dead had twitched back to life. He told her he didn't /T know what it meant. Didn't /T know what he wanted from her, if anything. But he knew that the idea of those men putting their hands on her had made him feel something he hadn't /T felt in years. The impulse. Brooke should have left, should have called the police or a taxi or her best friend who would have had opinions. Lots of opinions. Instead, she reached across the space between them and took his hand. His fingers were scarred, she noticed. Small white lines across the knuckles. Evidence of a life lived violently. She asked what he wanted to happen now, and her voice was steadier than she felt. Arcady looked at their joined hands like he couldn't /T quite believe they were real. He told her he wanted her safe, wanted her to finish her shift tomorrow without fear, wanted to take her to dinner somewhere that wasn't /T the hotel, where she could order whatever she wanted without checking the prices. He wanted to know what made her laugh, what kept her awake at night besides the obvious, whether she had ever been to Moscow. He wanted, he said with something like wonder in his voice, to hear her accent every day for the foreseeable future, because it was the most beautiful sound he had encountered in this gray city. It was such a ridiculous thing to say, so incongruent with everything else about him, that Brooke laughed. A real laugh this time, bright and startled. And Arcady smiled, the kind of smile that transformed his entire face, made him look younger and infinitely more dangerous, because now she could see exactly how charming he could be when he wanted to be. He told her she could stay in the guest room, that his security would ensure no one bothered her. That in the morning, they would figure out the logistics of keeping her safe while she decided whether she wanted anything to do with a man who came with the kind of baggage that required armed escorts. The guest room was bigger than her entire apartment. Brooke lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, trying to process the fact that she was sleeping in a Russian mob boss /S penthouse because she had been attacked in a parking garage. This was not how her life was supposed to. She was supposed to be curating exhibits, publishing papers, living the kind of quiet academic life that came with cardigans and reading glasses. Instead, she was entangled with a man who carried guns and spoke in violence. But here was the thing Brooke kept coming back to, the thought that circled her mind like a shark. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she didn't /T feel alone. Not just physically safe, though that was part of it, but seen. Arcady had looked at her like she mattered, like her accent was something beautiful instead of something to be mocked, like her exhaustion and her fear and her scraped palms were things worth his attention. It was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. She fell asleep still trying to decide which feeling would win. Morning came with coffee and the smell of something baking. Brooke found Arcady in the kitchen, which was somehow more surreal than everything else. He was wearing dark jeans and a black t-shirt, no jacket, no weapon visible, and he was making blinny with the kind of focused concentration she imagined he brought to everything. He looked up when she entered, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Then he asked how she took her coffee, and the domesticity of the question in this insane context made something in Brooke /S chest tighten. They ate breakfast in the dining room that overlooked the city, and Arcady explained the security arrangements. A driver who would take her to and from work, 2 men in rotation who would maintain invisible perimeters, upgraded locks on her apartment, a phone that couldn't /T be traced. It was overwhelming. Military-grade protection for a hotel server. Brooke asked what it cost because nothing was free, especially not from men like him. Arcady set down his coffee and looked at her with those ice-blue eyes that were somehow warm now in the morning light. He told her it cost nothing, that this was not a transaction, that if she wanted to walk away right now, never see him again, he would still ensure she was protected because the threat was real, and it was his fault she was in danger. But, he continued, voice dropping into a register that made her skin heat if she wanted to stay. If she was even remotely curious about what might exist between them, then the cost was simple: honesty, time, the willingness to see him as he actually was, not the myth or the monster, but the man who still woke up with nightmares and who had learned to be alone because it was safer than caring. Brooke told him she needed to think, needed to get to work, process, breathe. He nodded like he had expected nothing else and called for the driver. But before she left, he caught her hand, that same gentle grip that seemed impossible from someone capable of such violence. He told her that whatever she decided, she should know one thing. In the 3 weeks since he first saw her, she had occupied more of his thoughts than any business deal, any threat, any ambition. That he was not a good man by most measures, but he was trying to be better. For her, if she would let him, it was too much, too fast, too intense. Brooke pulled her hand away and left, and spent the entire car ride to work trying to convince herself that the smart choice was to run. The safe choice was to disappear. The sane choice was to forget Arcady Volodin existed. But when she got to the hotel and saw the women who had mocked her accent now looking at her with something like nervousness, when Marcus avoided her gaze entirely, when the manager himself greeted her with uncharacteristic warmth, Brooke understood something fundamental had shifted. Arcady had claimed her, not as property, as priority, and every person in this building knew it. The next 2 weeks were a study in contradiction. Brooke went to work, took care of her mother, lived her normal life, except nothing was normal anymore. The security was invisible but omnipresent. The driver who introduced himself as Dimitri and who had kind eyes and absolutely no sense of humor about her safety. The apartment locks that clicked with military precision. The phone that Arcady had given her, which she told herself she wouldn't /T use, but which somehow ended up in her hand at odd hours. At first, just practical things. Confirming she got home safely. Checking that the security wasn't /T too intrusive. But gradually, the messages evolved. He asked about her mother, her degree, her dreams of curation. She asked about Moscow, his childhood, what he read in that library. The conversation stretched longer, grew more personal, until Brooke was staying up past midnight sharing stories about her undergraduate thesis on Baroque art, while Arcady sent her photos of paintings in private collections she would never otherwise see. It was courting, she realized. Old-fashioned and incongruent with everything else about their situation, but unmistakable. He was wooing her through text message and security details, through small gestures that showed he. Coffee delivered to her work in the morning, always with cream and the specific type of artificial sweetener she preferred. A book on Caravaggio that she had mentioned wanting. Flowers sent to her mother /S care facility, bright and cheerful in a room that desperately needed color. The first real date happened on a Tuesday. Arcady picked her up personally, no driver, just him in a black car that probably cost more than her college education. He wore a suit that made him look dangerous and devastating in equal measure, and when he saw her in the dress she had agonized over for an hour, his expression did something that made her feel powerful. They went to a Russian restaurant in Brighton Beach, intimate and authentic, where the owner greeted Arcady like family and seated them in a private room that looked out over the water. He ordered for both of them, checking with her first about preferences, and the food that arrived was revelation after revelation. They talked for hours, about everything and nothing. He told her stories about growing up in Moscow in the 90s, the chaos and opportunity and violence that had shaped him. She told him about Alabama, her father/S death when she was 16, her mother/S slow disappearance into illness. They discovered shared loves, architecture. The specific Waylight looked at Dawn. They argued about philosophy, literature, whether redemption was possible for people who had done unforgivable things. And underneath all of it, there was the chemistry. The kind that made the air feel thick, that turned casual touches into something electric. His hand on the small of her back as they walked to the car. Her fingers brushing his when she reached for her wine glass. The way his eyes tracked her mouth when she spoke. It was intoxicating and terrifying, this wanting. Brooke had dated before, had even thought she was in love once or twice, but this was different. This was the kind of attraction that came with consequences, with the understanding that if she let herself fall, there would be no casual recovery. When he drove her home, Arcady walked her to her door like a gentleman from another era. He told her he had enjoyed the evening more than he could articulate. That he would like to do it again if she was willing. That he understood this was complicated, that he came with complications that might be insurmountable, but that he was selfish enough to want her anyway. Brooke, standing in the hallway of her modest apartment building with this man who represented everything she should avoid, made a choice. She kissed him, rose up on her toes, framed his face with her hands, and pressed her mouth to his. It was supposed to be gentle. A test. It became something else entirely. Arcady made a sound low in his throat and pulled her closer, one hand tangling in her hair, the other spanning her waist. The kiss was consummate, deep and searching and absolutely certain. It tasted like promise and danger, like the best kind of mistake. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Arcady rested his forehead against hers and said something in Russian that she didn't understand, but that sounded like a prayer. The relationship that developed over the next month was everything Brooke had never known she wanted. Arcady was attentive without being suffocating. He made time for her despite running what she was increasingly certain was an empire. Dinners that turned into long nights talking on his terrace. Mornings where he would show up at her apartment with breakfast and help her get ready for work. Slow afternoons in museums where he listened to her explain paintings with the kind of focus that made her feel like the only person in the world. But there was also the reality of who he was. The phone calls he took in Russian that made his expression go cold. The meetings that he never discussed. The scars she was discovering on his body, evidence of a life lived in violence. The nightmares that woke him gasping, reaching for weapons that were N/T there. Brooke learned when to push and when to give him space. Learned that the man who could be ruthless in business was devastatingly gentle with her, that he was capable of tenderness that seemed impossible given everything else. And Arcady, for his part, was learning too. Learning to let someone in. To trust that she wouldn't use his vulnerabilities as weapons. To believe that maybe, possibly, he could have something good without it being destroyed. They were careful with each other. Conscious of the fragility of what they were building. Until the night everything nearly shattered. It started with a phone call at 2 a.m. Brooke was asleep in Arcady/S bed, had been staying there more often than not lately, and the sound of his phone jolted her awake. She felt him leave the bed, heard the low conversation in Russian from the next room. When he came back, his expression was carved from stone. He told her there was a problem. That the rival organization had made a move, that he needed to handle it, and that she needed to stay in the penthouse with security until it was resolved. Brooke, still half asleep and confused, agreed. She didn't understand the scope of what was happening until later that day when news broke about a warehouse fire in Red Hook. Multiple casualties, suspected gang violence. The kind of story that made headlines for a day before disappearing under the next crisis. Arcady called her that afternoon. His voice was different, flat. The warmth she had grown addicted to was gone, replaced by something arctic. He told her he was handling it, told her to stay inside, told her he would call when it was safe. Then he hung up and Brooke was left in the penthouse with security guards who wouldn't /T make eye contact and a television showing footage of a building that was still smoldering. She tried calling back, texted, got nothing. For 36 hours, she existed in a state of suspended terror, imagining every worst-case scenario. That he was dead, that he was killing, that he had decided she was too much of a liability and would disappear her like he probably disappeared problems. The lack of information was its own torture. When he finally came back, he looked like he had aged a decade. There was blood on his shirt, barely visible against the black fabric but unmistakable. His knuckles were split. He had a cut above his eye that someone had stitched badly. He looked at her standing in his living room and something in his expression crumbled. Arcady told her everything, not the sanitized version he had given before, but the truth, the bodies, the decisions he had made, the violence he had orchestrated to protect his territory, his people, her. He laid it out in brutal detail, giving her no room to romanticize or ignore what he was capable of. He told her about the man he had killed personally, the one who had ordered the attack on her in the parking garage. How he had looked him in the eye and pulled the trigger without hesitation. He told her he would do it again, would do worse. That this was who he was, and if she couldn't /T accept that, she needed to leave now because he wouldn't /T survive getting more attached and then watching her walk away in horror. It was a test. Brooke understood that. He was pushing her away, giving her every reason to run because he expected her to run. Because everyone eventually did. She thought about it. God, she thought about it. Thought about her mother, her normal life, her dreams that didn't /T include men who killed people and considered it a Tuesday. But she also thought about the man who had held her while she cried about her mother /S latest decline. Who had listened to her explain the difference between who had kissed her like she was precious and looked at her like she was the only light in his dark world. She told him she wasn't /T going anywhere, that she was terrified, yes, that she would probably need therapy to process what he had just told her, definitely, but that she had chosen him, was choosing him, would keep choosing him as long as he wanted her to. Arcady looked at her like she had just offered him salvation he didn't /T deserve. He crossed the room in 3 strides, pulled her into his arms, and held on like she was the only thing keeping him from drowning. And maybe she was. The aftermath was complicated. Arcady made arrangements for Brooke to quit the hotel. It was too exposed, too vulnerable. He offered to support her financially while she figured out what came next, but she refused. Compromised instead. Agreed to let him help her find work at a private gallery, something that aligned with her. Started taking Russian lessons online, partly practical, partly because she wanted to understand the language he dreamed in. Moved officially into the penthouse after a long conversation about autonomy and dependence and what it meant to build a life with someone whose business was violence. They established boundaries. Things she didn't /T want to know. Things he needed to tell her anyway. A safe word for when the reality of his world became too much and she needed space. Therapy, both individual and together, with a counselor who specialized in trauma and had seen enough to not be shocked by their situation. It wasn't /T perfect. There were nights when Brooke woke up crying, overwhelmed by the impossibility of loving someone who carried so much death. There were days when Arcady pulled away, convinced she would eventually leave and trying to protect himself from the inevitable. There were also mornings in bed where he traced the contours of her face and told her in Russian and English all the ways she had changed him. Evenings where she would find him in his study, and they would talk about everything and nothing until dawn. Moments of such profound intimacy that Brooke understood why people wrote poetry about love. This messy, complicated, sometimes terrifying thing that made everything else make sense. 6 months in, Arcady took her to Moscow. It was the first time he had been back in 3 years, and Brooke understood what a declaration that was. He introduced her to the family he had left behind. His mother, who looked at her with shrewd eyes and asked pointed questions in Russian that Arcady refused to translate, but that made him blush. His sister, who hugged Brooke and told her in accented English that it was about time someone made Arcady happy. They visited the places of his childhood. The apartment building where he grew up, now gentrified beyond recognition. The park where he had learned to fight. The cemetery where his first love was buried, a pilgrimage that Brooke insisted on making with him despite his protests. They stood at the grave in silence, snow falling softly around them, and Arcady told her about the woman who had died, about the guilt that had haunted him, about how he had thought he would never feel anything like love again. about how he told Brooke that she had given him something he thought was lost forever. Hope. The possibility of a future that wasn't just survival. A reason to be better than the worst things he had done. She told him she loved him, there in the Moscow snow with ghosts all around them. Told him in English and in her careful, accented Russian. Told him that she had never expected this, hadn't wanted it, but that she couldn't imagine her life without. That he was her home in a way that had nothing to do with geography. Arkady kissed her there among the headstones, and it felt like a vow. Back in New York, life found a rhythm. Brooke thrived at the gallery, using her knowledge and Arkady connections to build something impressive. Her mother condition stabilized with the better care that money could provide, and Brooke made peace with the fact that her life had become unrecognizable from the one she had planned. Arkady worked on transitioning his business interests toward legitimacy. It was slow, complicated, the kind of thing that would take years and might never be complete, but he was trying, and that mattered. They talked about the future sometimes, what it might look like. Marriage, maybe, though Brooke had complicated feelings about binding herself legally to someone with his history. Children, possibly, though the idea of bringing kids into this world terrified them both. A house somewhere with more space, more light, more normal. But mostly they focused on the present, on building something sustainable out of the unlikely connection that had started with mocked accents and parking garage violence. On learning each other languages, literal and metaphorical. On creating a relationship that honored both who they were and who they were trying to become. It wasn't the fairy tale Brooke had imagined as a girl. There was no prince, just a man with blood on his hands and nightmares in his eyes. There was no castle, just a penthouse fortress with security that never slept. There was no happily ever after, just the daily choice to stay, to fight, to love despite and because of everything. But it was real, and it was theirs. And when Arkady looked at her across the dinner table or the museum gallery or the bed they shared, Brooke saw everything she needed to know in those ice-blue eyes. She was loved. Completely, desperately, by a man who had forgotten how until she reminded him, and her accent, that southern drawl that had been mocked and minimized her entire life, was the sound he loved most in the world. Not despite its difference, because of it, because it was hers, because it was the first thing that had made him feel something after years of numbness. Because when she said his name with those soft vowels and drawn-out syllables, it sounded like coming home. They were broken in complementary ways, she and this Russian mob boss with his scars and secrets. But together, they made something whole, something worth protecting, something worth fighting for, and in a world that had tried to make them both smaller, they had found each other and built something vast. The evening it all came full circle happened almost a year to the day after that first encounter in the wine cellar. Brooke was at a gallery opening, her first major exhibition as assistant curator, and the space was filled with the kind of people who had once made her feel small. Wealthy, connected, powerful. She was wearing a dress that Arkady had chosen, deep green silk that made her skin glow, and she moved through the crowd with confidence that came from knowing exactly who was waiting for her at home. The same women who had mocked her accent at the Metropolitan were there. Older now. Brooke saw them notice her, saw recognition flicker across their faces, saw them lean together to whisper. She waited for the old anxiety to surface. It didn't come. Instead, she felt only a mild curiosity about what they might say. One of them approached, champagne in hand, expression carefully neutral. She complimented the exhibition. Mentioned she remembered Brooke from the hotel. Made a comment that was almost but not quite an apology about how young people. Brooke smiled, thanked her, was about to move on when Arkady appeared at her side, his hand finding the small of her back with the kind of casual possessiveness that made her skin warm. He greeted the woman in English, then switched to Russian, the same rapid-fire delivery he had used that day in the hotel. Brooke didn't need translation. She knew what he was saying. Could read it in the way the woman paled, in the subtle shift of power in the space. He was reminding her exactly who Brooke was to him, what that meant, what consequences there would be for any disrespect. It was unnecessary. Brooke didn't need protecting anymore, but it was also deeply, absurdly romantic in the way that only Arkady could manage, turning a potential confrontation into a declaration of devotion. When the woman retreated, Arkady turned to Brooke with an expression that was part apology, part defiance. He asked if he had overstepped, and his accent wrapped around the words like silk. Brooke laughed, told him he was ridiculous, told him she loved him anyway, told him that she could fight her own battles now, but that watching him fight them for her was still one of her favorite things. They left the opening early, drove through the city with the windows down and Russian music playing low, ended up at the penthouse where they had built their improbable life. And there, in the space between the violence of his world and the normalcy of hers, they loved each other with the kind of intensity that came from knowing exactly how unlikely this was, how precious, how temporary everything could be. Brooke fell asleep that night with R.S. arm around her waist, his breath warm against her neck, his voice murmuring words in Russian that she was learning to understand. Words that meant mine. Words that meant always. Words that meant you are the only woman I have ever truly loved. And her accent, that drawl that marked her as different, as other, as someone who didn't /T belong. That was the last thing he heard before sleep claimed him. The sound he had been waiting for his entire life without knowing it. The sound of home. Hey, loves, I have to say, this story stayed with me for a while. Sometimes life brings people together in the most unexpected ways, just to remind us that everyone deserves to be seen and loved for who they are. If this story made you feel something, then it did exactly what it was meant to do. Let me know in the comments what you thought. And don't forget to follow the channel for more emotional stories full of twists and intense moments. Big hugs, and see you in the next story. Bye-bye.